Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We have much to learn from our First Nations people about connection and respect. And 65,000 years, well, I think that is impressive. We have a lot to learn from them. Well, I've explored the world of regenerative agriculture and environmental issues in various podcasts and health as well, and diet and exercise, the impact of sugar, etc. But my guest today has really gone out there and spread that message to literally millions of people. And I have to say, I have so admired his work for 10 years now. My guest is Damon Gameau. Now, Damon is a bit of a hero. He's now a full-time director since his success with That Sugar film in 2014. And 5 years later, he made the film 2040. Now, That Sugar film, together with Sarah Wilson, who was running the I Quit Sugar movement, and I've had her on as a guest to talk about that. I mean, I've often said that both Damon Gameau and Sarah Wilson have done more for alerting people to the dangers of sugar than the dental industry, the dental profession, have done in the last 70 years. And I'm not being critical of the dental profession. I'm proud of the fact that for 70 years, the profession has been talking about that. But in terms of getting the message out, I'm eternally grateful to Damon and Sarah for both of those. Now, his wonderfully inspiring documentary 2040. Now, if you haven't seen that, it is a must. It included also, as well as the film, an extensive impact campaign that has been seen by 1.5 million students and have been taught with curriculum materials, and it's also reached hundreds of farmers who've received assistance to switch to regenerative practices, plus the building of the first seaweed platform in Tasmania. And I believe there are 8 seaweed farms going around Australia now as a result of that 2040 film. In fact, we hear so much about doom and gloom in the climate, and what was so inspiring and empowering about that 2040 movie was it literally provided a vision of utilising practices that are available to us today to turn society and the environment around. Now, on the back of that, I think Damon was nominated for New South Wales Australian of the Year for his work in the regenerative movement, and he's the driving force behind Regenerators. And that can be found on the website theregenerators.org, where there are many areas of action that we talk about in this episode. His current film is called Regenerate Australia 2030. We've actually added the trailer at the end of this interview, and the film leverages storytelling, strategic partnerships, and targeted community outreach to harness an irresistible vision for a safer, fair, more resilient nation and create a powerful model for realising community-driven solutions. Look, we've talked to Helena Norberg-Hodge from Local Futures, and this just dovetails so beautifully into this. And I would encourage you to go to that site, theregenerators.org, and find out which area of action you are most interested in and would like to become part of. His latest project is Future Council, where he takes a group of children on a tour exploring issues about the future of our planet. I'm not going to spoil it. He shares some of that insight with us in this episode. It's a wonderful conversation. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Damon Gameau. Welcome to the show, Damon.
Hi, Ron. Lovely to be here.
Damon, I have so admired all of your work over the last 10 years, and I think it's brilliant. There's so much I wanted to talk to you about today. There's so many things you're into that I'm also very passionate about. The first one, of course, was your 2014 film, That Sugar film. And I just before we came on, I mentioned that Sarah Wilson, who I Quit Sugar movement, and you did more in those two movements than the dental profession did in the last 70 years. And we've been talking about it for 70 years, but you guys really nailed it and really made a difference. I'm going to sound like a director here, Damon, but what was the motivation and what was the key messages apart from don't eat sugar?
Yeah, well, the motivation was just at the time how much confusion there seemed to be around that particular topic. There were very much, it felt like two sets of camps that were saying, hey, sugar's fine, don't worry about it. And then there was sort of that Sarah, David Gillespie kind of camp, which was saying, no, it's really bad for you.
David, I should acknowledge David too.
Yeah, and so I just sort of quite genuinely wanted to find out for myself because my eldest daughter had just been born. And so embarked on this kind of experiment, not knowing whether anything was going to happen. And so really shot at very low budget. It was a bit of a risk, I guess, just to see if sugar was going to impact my body. But then given what it was doing to my body within just 3 weeks, that's when we realised that we had a bigger story and then applied for larger funding and went out to other people that we wanted to be in the film. So it all just kind of happened and unfolded in the way that it did. And then, as you said, I think it took all of us by surprise how much the film resonated, not just in Australia, but around the world and with school groups and policy, and different parliaments did screenings and changed policy. And it was just a wild ride for me and really showed me how powerful storytelling is as an agent for change. And that really, I guess, lit a fire in me in wanting to tell more stories, but not just tell the story, also marry it to like an impact campaign so that people can feel a strong emotion when they watch the film, but then you give them tools to enact or transmute that emotion into some kind of change, because I think that's what's been lacking. We often tell a story and people feel something so strongly, and then 10 minutes later you're on Instagram or checking your emails and that feeling's dissipated and we've lost that moment. So how do we capture people when they have that feeling and turn it into something tangible?
But I mean, the message was clearly that sugar impacts on our health. But here you were in 2014 learning that message. I don't know how old you were at the time, but there have been many years before that where that wasn't the public health message. And to this day, what did that teach you about public health messages?
Well, that it's complex, that I think, as we've found even the last few years with any number of medical cases that have been presented to us as a society, it depends where you're reading, what you're looking at, who's influencing your decision-making. It's who's funding some of the science. It's such a mess, and I really feel for people right now, not just in science, but in any kind of key topic. We're so fragmented now. It's so hard to know where to get honest information or who to believe that we're really we're tribalizing and we're kind of disintegrating some of our key pillars of democracy because we don't know how to collectively make sense of things anymore. And I think no more is that clearly articulated in the science field or medical field, or what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat. And I think what that film taught me or that journey was that we are all very, very different human beings, and there's a number of factors that influence our health markers, and it isn't simple as black and white. And that's why I think the film had a very strong message of saying, look, I don't personally think sugar's evil. I don't think we should brand it as something like that. But here's a film that shows you where it's hidden in foods that you might not be aware of. So now it's up to you. You now are empowered to make the decision about how much sugar you're having. Because I think at the time, most people knew that there was sugar in a Kit Kat or a can of Coke, but they were less aware of the sugars in the yogurts and the muesli bars and things like that. So really, that's all the film tried to do. And I think that's why it did connect. I certainly didn't want to preach to anyone. I just wanted to explain to them where the hidden sugars were found. And I think also what worked is that, we tried to tell that story in a narrative that wasn't dry or particularly academic. It was fun and playful and used all the colours and the aesthetic and tone of the sugar industry themselves to make it more appealing and for families to go along and see it together and then go home and check their pantries. So I think there was a number of factors that came together that made that film work, but it certainly changed my life and has led to some, extraordinary conversations and meetings and experiences in my life. So I'm incredibly grateful for it. And Sarah and David Wilson and lots of others, obviously I just followed on the coattails of or enhanced or amplified their terrific work. But, there's people still doing that right now.
Yeah. Well, I think those three words, you are empowered, are really the powerful message above everything else. And I should also have acknowledged David Gillespie, who's been on this program as well, and I love his work, and same with Sarah as well. But it's a story of influence on healthcare that is easy to miss, but once you hear it, very difficult to ignore. And that's from a health practitioner with 45 years of clinical experience. So, anyway, but you then went on in 2019 to tackle an even bigger problem, and you came up with this fabulous film. I mean, 2040, I mean, honestly, we hear so much about gloom and doom, but this was so inspiring, it was so empowering, and it embraced existing solutions. And I know you've got this regenerator movement, and we're going to talk about that, but knowing all you know now, what does regeneration mean to you?
Oh, it's a massive question.
It's okay.
I think the simplest way to describe it would be that, we are living in a degenerative economy right now, an extractive economy that is doing enormous damage to the planet, but also to our own health. And, I think there's actually a lot of similarities between Sugarfilm and 2040 in the sense that they're both looking at the architecture of a system that is producing these outcomes, whether it is type 2 diabetes or dental decay, or it is, ocean plastics or climate change. They're all coming from the same flawed architecture. And both those films are trying to address that at the very core, is that, this is a moment that we have to acknowledge that we have to change the system, and we have to move from one that is degenerative and doing damage to one that is regenerating and putting life back as the priority, because this system doesn't prioritize life right now, whether it's human health or animals or plant life. It commodifies those things in order to survive and keep going. And it's a rapacious growth machine that has to keep eating and will find any way it can to extract more things. And that's just, we all know how that's going to end. And I think we all intuit that we're coming to the end of a particular story of how we've been living as human beings with each other and the planet. And so I guess the idea of regeneration is, what does that new story look like? What does it look like to actually value life, to value community, to value our health, to value our landscapes and our oceans and our water and our air? That is regeneration. And it is extraordinary how much of that is going on around the world, where people are stepping away from this old system and story and trying to embrace something new. We don't hear about it because all our interaction and communication tools are designed for outrage. And so those good stories really don't get the traction that they deserve. But I've certainly spent the last 8 to 10 years looking at those stories and cannot but be filled with hope. There's going to still be an unraveling. There's still a letting go of this old story that I think we all feel we're going through right now. But certainly there's the seeds of something new that are sprouting everywhere around the world. And that's what gives me such excitement and gets me up every day, is that I get to go and speak to those people or tell stories about those people. And people are starting to do things really differently. So that's how I would basically describe regeneration. But I'd also say at a deeper level, it comes back to ourself. How do we regenerate ourselves? Because we're not going to heal the planet or each other unless we look at regeneration within. It's probably a longer conversation, but I'd say that we've built an entire civilization on a wound, on a deep wound that happened probably 10,000 years ago when we firstly separated from nature. We went from hunter and gatherer into sort of a more an agrarian culture, and suddenly it changed our dynamic with nature, especially in whipping and yoking an oxen to plough a field so you could make more calories. And if you didn't do it, your neighbour got more calories and you were at a disadvantage. But also, I think we went from abundance to a scarcity mindset at that same time. And the minute we went into scarcity, we developed ego and othering and hoarding and hierarchies and wars and separation. And that's the civilization we've built off that deep wound. And so I think now of, so many of our leaders, I don't see them, for example, as men. I see a lot of them as wounded boys. They're operating from this deep wound that needs more and more. And $1 billion isn't enough. I need $10 billion. And that's an incredibly unhealthy wound that's playing out. And yet we reward that wound. We make them president. We make them CEO instead of saying, well, hang on a minute. Like, is this actually what we want? Because if you look at all the hunter-gatherer societies, anyone with that wound, any young male that showed a narcissistic trait or was bragging about the big hunt was ostracized from the group, was ridiculed, sometimes killed in the Lakota tribes and other ones, whereas we make them the king of the kingdom and let them set the rules of the game. So I think that's, again, what regeneration means to me, is how do we start to operate from a healed place and make decisions and design our buildings and our cities and our food systems from a place of a healed place, not from this wound. And that's going to take a bit of work. And I think probably we're going to need to go even further down and be brought to our knees like we are in our own personal lives before we make a big change like that. I think society is kind of on the cusp of something like that. I don't think, it's going to be completely apocalyptic, but I think we do have to go a little further down the valley before we start coming up the other side again.
Wow. That is a wonderful summation of the last 10,000 years, Tamer. Well done you. Well done you. But I think, as somebody who's followed influence of corporations on policy, and I'm following, we're all following what goes on in America. It's probably the greatest show on earth, or the most terrifying show on earth. But I heard Robert F. Kennedy say something which I thought was really interesting, and that was that almost every product we buy, be it food, be it clothes, be it anything, the cost to health and the environment is never factored in. It's never factored in, and society is left to carry the bill. And it makes such a compelling story of trauma and, of threat. There's a threat. How do we deal with that threat? Well, we do something to soothe ourselves, and ultimately that soothing generally means buying something else, and we learn that doesn't work. So the influence of that message is, and that's something that after the pandemic, even as somebody who's followed this for 30 or 40 years, I was so shocked by that level of capture. And as we move into the world of AI and media, and you talk about how do we know what is true, oh my God, there's a fair way to go down into the valley, I think, before we emerge the other side.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, you've touched on a lot of points there around that all come back to that idea of the wound. That is mass consumption. That's what it is. And so once we heal that, we realize we are enough, then our extraction will lower as well. And so it is all deeply connected. And also we just have an environment that makes it almost impossible to do the right thing. And I found that even with the sugar film is that we're bombarded. Our subconscious is bombarded by messaging, by really clever science that understands how our brains work, that tell us we are deficient in things and we need this to feel better. And so there's a book about this called limbic capitalism, which is just that we've created this entire system that is triggering dopamine everywhere you turn, whether it's online or walking down a street, that, God forbid, I admire anyone that's able to maintain their health, be that mental or physical, in a world that really, when you look at it from a different angle, is quite psychotic in a lot of ways. It is not conducive to a balanced human being and a thriving community and caring and slowing down. It's just gone at a frenetic pace. And we are ramping that dial up, as you said, with AI and everything that's happening around the world, some of the policies, some of the leaders that are getting into positions of power now. It's all almost a scorched earth policy where it is just kind of consumption, turn up the volume. And to me, that's the signs of something nearing its end, that it's that this is the last stage of, I actually saw an article this morning about one of the supermarkets that even on the groceries now, you can get an afterpay option on your basic groceries. So, I mean, that to me is the last dying stage, is that we can commodify even a cost of living crisis. There's an opportunity for an economic advantage for a company to get in there. I mean, that is as distorted as it gets. So I think we all feel that. We all know that. We just don't know what the hell to do about it or what comes next. And so, of course, we're going to go for sort of authoritarian figures that tell us that they can fix it and wind back the clock. I get that because we are so unsure about what's coming. But I think somewhere we have to sit in that uncertainty and we have to slow down and surrender to it and trust that what's going to come next will emerge as it does in our own personal lives. I'm sure you've been through something, Ron. I've been through something myself where you are brought to your knees and linearity stops. The time becomes non-linear. That's when magic comes in. That's when things you never could have predicted start to happen. And I think we're being forced into that because we want a rational, hyperlinear outcome to move forward. But that's fooling us. What we have to do in this moment is to surrender and stop to what is and feel the complexity and the uncertainty and then let something else come from that. But that's a very hard thing to do collectively.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've said two things that have really captured me. One is we are empowered and we are enough. They are two very important messages. But coming back to the Regenerator movement, which I know you describe as bringing together a community, taking action to regenerate and heal our planet. And we want to talk about some of those things. I mean, they're called action areas on the site, and let's anticipate some of the naysayers here. Let's address some of the pros and cons too. But let's talk about some of those action areas. And one of them is harmonise the system, which I think we've been talking about. But, is that it? Is that harmonise the system really about what we've just been discussing? Or is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so what we tried to do was just understand that, when it comes to regeneration or taking action, whether it's with the system or whether it's with landscapes or whether it's trying to fix the environment, everyone's got a different passion or area of interest. And sometimes we've been too prescriptive and just telling everyone what to do, like, eat less meat or ride your bike to work. And not everyone agrees with that. Not everyone wants to do that. And so we just tried to create this platform where it was very much specifically designed around people's own personal interests. Yeah, so we just tried to create this platform that aligns, I guess, to people's own specific interests so they can find something that they're really passionate about. And that's everything from, whether it's soil and wanting to get back into agriculture, whether it's in energy, whether it's transport, whether it's landscape repair or oceans, whatever it might be. But there's also a couple of sections there on the bigger systemic issues that we're facing and how do we start to come together and address those? Who are the organisations that are working on new systems or perhaps new models for social media and how we interact that aren't incentivised by division and tribalisation, but actually reward people for coming together? So you get more likes if you can solve a problem together as opposed to being the sole voice in a particular topic. So just really interesting new thinking that's emerging around democracy. For example, in Taiwan, what they're doing now in terms of creating much more transparency around governments and the budgets and policy decisions that are live streamed, like really interesting things going on around the world that people might not know about. We just wanted to create a database or an area where people can come to, particularly, as we said, as this old system starts to unravel and shows these signs of fragmenting, which it's doing now, rather than people freak out and go, what are we going to do? Send them to somewhere where we can say, you know what, there's people that have been working on this stuff for 50, 60 years, these pioneers that now their time has come, learn about what they've been offering up, learn about these new models that they've been designing because, these things aren't as radical when things start to fall apart.
Yes, the interesting part about being live, because I know in education, again, we're coming back to AI, the effect of AI is that live exams are going to be coming back to universities. You're going to have to sit down in an exam room and show that you are doing it. And I think this is ultimately where democracy, it's interesting to hear something like Taiwan. I mean, I was not aware of that.
Yeah.
But I love that idea because how will we know if it's real or not? Well, hopefully we can trust the live feed and see exactly what's going on.
Yeah. It's a really interesting story too. We won't go too much into it, but it came about because of a protest, and the protesters sat in the Parliament House, and the lead protester ended up being hired by the government because they set up all these cameras and they live streamed their protest, and the government said, okay, you want to do things differently, work with us, let's find out how to do this differently. And so they redesigned all their government websites and how they make their decisions. And to me, that sort of stuff is really exciting because it does offer up potential new ways. It might not work for every region, we know that, and the size of the population, all of course, but at least it shows that human beings are capable of extraordinary thinking when their backs are against the wall. And that, again, is ultimately my hope. I just think right now so many human beings, are being kept blind to what's actually going on, and when they do understand what's happening, we can actually work together and create something really powerful because I think some of your listeners will understand that I think most of us are largely altruistic. We are good people that respect each other and want to live in a good community, but we're governed by that very small percentage of largely psychopathic people. And they're setting the rules of the game. And so when we understand that they are trying to keep us divided against each other, when we can find ways to unite, then I think we can really create some powerful change. And I just had an experience actually the last couple of weeks where I was very lucky to go to Antarctica, and I was on a boat with 150 people, and it was just almost a microcosm of the world. There were, people that were complete climate deniers there. There were even flat earthers there, like really interesting cross-section of people. And I was the sort of representing the climate story. But it was terrific to have face-to-face discussions with these people that were deniers, and then to hear where their perspective was coming from, how they got to their point of view, for me to be able to share mine. And then we found that we actually probably had 95% of things in common. There might have been a couple of things we're going to disagree on, but largely we felt as frustrated by the system, as desperate for change, as wanting a better future for our children as each other. And yet if we met online, we'd probably think we were at the other ends of the spectrum. So I think this is really important to understand, that certainly from my travels, that we have so much in common as human beings, and we are just being grotesquely misled by a very small group of powerful people with lots of money, keys to the kingdom, and they are having their way with us, and no more. It's time to reclaim or re-empower ourselves, as you said.
Yeah. Well, I share your optimism about humanity. I mean, that sounds an odd thing to say at this particular time, but I believe that because people ultimately want the best for themselves, their families, their children, their grandchildren, and no one wants to live in a dirty home, a dirty city, a dirty country, a dirty world. I mean, I think that's commonality, whether you're a climate denier or not.
That's right.
This is obviously what some of the things that you found in face-to-face. How fantastic. I mean, energy is one of those issues, isn't it, that we hear so much about. And I guess, with good reason in some ways. I mean, in the sense that, I'm a huge fan of solar. I've got solar panels on my roof. My car is a plug-in hybrid. I barely buy petrol because of that. But what happens to what goes into making those solar panels? What happens to those solar panels when I no longer need to use them?
Yeah.
This is part of the challenge in this rethinking of energy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think the reality is that we've created such a massive system now. I mean, it's such an extraordinary, complicated global system that requires massive amounts of energy that no matter what we do, we're going to be causing damage to the planet now. It's just so big. But I think what my research has certainly showed me is that there's no doubt the 21st century was the century of oil and the century of fossil fuels. And these companies made extraordinary amounts of money and continue to today. And they've been very good at deflecting some of the awareness off them onto other technologies. And this is all documented now right back to the 50s. Exxon themselves were doing all sorts of planning back then about renewables and then realised and doubled down on the denial. But I think what's interesting, even with the renewables discussion, is if you look at the amount of renewables we're going to require in 2040 to power the whole economy, which is still an enormous amount of mining, often in countries that we shouldn't be mining, in the Congo and these kind of parts of the world. It's about 28 million tons of resources, so silicon and copper and all these materials we need. But the fossil fuel industry extracts 15 billion tons a year. So 15 billion versus 28 million. Now, 15 billion tons is destroying our atmosphere, is destroying our ocean, is damaging animals, all sorts of things. And yet they've done a brilliant job of saying, well, hang on, we've got to build all these things. And they're right. But it's a brilliant deflection tactic from the damage that they are actually doing themselves. And yes, we're going to have to rebuild these kind of materials. My hope is that, it's happening quite quickly, that even the design, the DNA of some of these materials make them renewable. So the big turbines now are recyclable. 96% of them can be recycled. So in the best case scenario is we develop remanufacturing industries that take these big renewable things, break them down and rebuild them and put them out there again. And there's, again, examples of that. Countries like Japan have done that around certain precious metals. They recycle 99% of their metals because they created jobs for people to take apart washing machines and toasters and phones and reuse the materials. So we could do it with the right policies. It's just that some of these big industries have been so good since the 70s at just smashing any kind of environmental regulation, any kind of threat to their constant perpetual growth that they require. They have just been savage and brilliant at kind of shaping the narrative around that and ruling it as some kind of big government, socialism experiment. Whereas sometimes it's a government just saying, no, we want clean water for our citizens. But all that's been hijacked. And as you know, the same in the food industry, some of these large corporations now have more power than our own governments and their own democracies. These clauses like the trade treaties, the ISDS clauses, where a company can sue a government if it threatens to breach their profits or impact their profits. And there's countless stories of companies suing governments for billions of dollars, and the government can't fight the case, and so they just build and trash the bit of coast or build the coal mine on the river, whatever it might be. So this is a big problem, not just environmentally, but for our health, for all sorts of things, that we have the illusion of democracy right now. But the reality is that we are living in a sort of a corporate technocracy that is a financial fascism, if you want to call it, that actually sits above our governments and is plundering the planet and plundering our own health.
Corporate technocracy. I've kind of seen it as corporate socialism often too, or corporate communism, like when you talk to people in America, oh, national health, my God, we're not a communist country,
Exactly.
but a company goes down and they're too big to fail.
That's right.
They're too big to fail, and
man.
they see no irony in this. Interestingly, though, Damon, I think, the tobacco, it's called the tobacco playbook.
Yeah.
Because they knew in the 1940s that tobacco was bad, but it wasn't until 2006 that the government actually legislated that it was an addictive thing. So, and it's interesting too, something we never hear about is the IMF did a report on fossil fuel subsidies.
That's right.
And found they get a subsidy of $5.6 trillion a year, which is equivalent to $10 million a minute.
That's right.
And we've been talking for 20 minutes. So while we've been talking, the fossil fuel industry has gained $200 million in subsidies. So
that's right.
We never hear about that.
No, and yet we call it a free market. All these people are proponents of the free market. And again, that's just an illusion. It's a joke. It's a rhetoric that we all buy. And it's just nonsense. And so, let's see what would really happen if you didn't subsidize renewables and fossil fuels. Like the renewable energy would actually roll out at a much faster rate because it's cheaper now. That said, I think, again, the complexity of this topic is vast, as you know, that there is a reason we subsidize some fossil fuels, and it does make a cost of living cheaper for people, or petrol, or our farmers. So it's not as simple as just saying, right, let's just eradicate all these things, because that would actually be quite deleterious. We have to be careful around this stuff, as we found, I think it was at Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, when they said, we're going to go organic, we're just going to ban fertilizers, without any kind of proper thought through structure. And of course the farmers revolted, and of course they protested, and it was just a disastrous move, because these things take time. The landscape needs time or years to get off its addiction to some of these fertilizers. So we need to support people in this transition if we're going to do this. And that's where we need a thriving democracy and a functioning, robust government. But as you said, so many of them have been captured by higher powers that they don't want to do this. They're all receiving funding from these same industries that are doing the damage. So it becomes illusory in terms of this actually being a democracy.
Mm-hmm. The other one that I know you're passionate about, and I certainly am, we've had so many wonderful guests on our program in the regenerative agriculture field, and this reviving of soils is a big one. I mean, we've had Joel Salatin, Alan Savory, Terry McCosker, Charlie Massey, Charlie Arnott, I mean, they're just heroes to me. And I just think they, and when Charlie Massey says, rather than dominating nature, we should enable it.
That's right.
I mean, this is another major focus for you.
Well, it's the perfect, you were saying before, how do you describe regeneration? I think what's happening in the soils and farming is the perfect metaphor, in that we take an industrialized system that is extractive, dominates nature, controls nature through, control the weeds, control the pests, and then regenerative agriculture gets rid of all those things and lets the natural immune system of soil kick in to do all the right things. And then you get this incredible, staggering amount of life that comes back into the soil, which then feeds the plants, which then goes into our guts, which feeds the diversity in our guts. And so that, to me, sums up the perfect analogy of a monoculture that destroys life versus a thriving regenerative life that brings it back. So that's why I feel so passionate about that. And in fact, a film I just finished, which will be coming out later this year, I took this group of children around Europe to meet some CEOs and to learn about nature. And one of the things we did was visit this regeneration landscape where the kids were able to go into this big monoculture wheat field. We took some soil samples, we took the temperature there, and then we went into this big agroforestry setup where they'd grown all their food with diverse crops and healthy soil, and we measured the temperature, what was being transpired up and re-radiated back into the atmosphere. But then I showed them under the microscope the difference in the soil, and the kids were just like, ah, because of the amount of life. And then, the soil scientists were explaining to them that, yeah, you might eat a tomato from both those fields, but look at the life in the tomato from the agroforestry versus the monoculture. It smells the same and it looks the same, but you'd have to eat 10 tomatoes to get the same level of nutrients that you got from the agroforestry soil. So just trying to get that message to people, because then, regenerative agriculture has all sorts of benefits for water retention, for the climate. But if we can get people in the front door through the food story, which is, hey, this is really good for your gut health and whatnot, then I think we're going to bring more people on board. It almost becomes a gateway drug. You use the food as a way in for people to start understanding about the environmental benefits of this type of farming. And again, there's still division over it. It's still not a panacea, because we need to work with farmers that have got agronomists in their ear. They've done a certain way of farming for years that's produced so much of our food for us. And they did it, as we know, they worked their absolute butts off to get that food to us. And they've done a great service. So we've got to be careful, again, about just kind of dismissing them as wrong and, hey, we've got to pick up this new form of farming. That kind of denies all the great work that they've done to get us to this point. It's just that our learning is shifting now. So how do we bring them along that journey? How do we subsidise them, incentivize them to start changing their practices, rather than vilifying them, which is, I think, an error we made with the fossil fuel workers. We just dismissed them instead of saying, hey, you guys powered our entire economy for 150 years and created all sorts of jobs and wealth for us. Thanks. But we've learnt this new thing now. How can we escort you and retrain you into jobs of the future? So I think we just have to do that in a lot of industries in the next decade or so, whether it's the automotive industry, the creative industry, as we're seeing with AI. There is disruption coming. And how do we do it in the most human way, where we do heal that wound we talked about, and we do it in the best way we can?
I often feel that people who are very reluctant to change feel that a change is a rejection of the past rather than a springboard to the future. And, I think that is, I love the fact that, why not honour what has gone before and what has been created, but say, hey, the world has changed and now we need to use that as a springboard moving forward.
Well, that's what if we weren't governed by largely sociopaths, that's what we'd be doing, I think. And again, we get back to this.
I only wish that wasn't true, but you are right.
And as we said, when the incentive of this system is purely, extraction, financial growth, then humans get discarded. Anything, nature gets discarded. As you said before, we don't embed the true cost of anything, because we've just got this narrow focus of our success, which is just madness, because we're not seeing the impact that financial growth has on human beings and living beings and the planet. And unless we address that, we are going to fly off the cliff. We have to look at new ways of what we measure. What do we value? We should be looking at the soil health on the nightly news. We should be looking at atmospheric pollution, the well-being of the community. Once we put those as metrics we want to strive for, more people, they'll be visible, and we'll talk about it more and we'll solve problems. But right now we're just looking at the stock exchange, and we're just ignoring all the externalities that allow that stock exchange to increase, which is crazy.
Yeah, no. Charlie Massey talks about 5 cycles of solar and sun and water and biodiversity, but he makes the point that the 5th cycle is the most important one, and that is the human social cycle, which is exactly what you're addressing. You've got a film coming out at the end of the year. That's an interesting. What is it? What are you calling it? When is it being released?
Yeah, so release date's not exactly sure yet, but probably, I think, July, August. And it's called Future Council. And I took 8 children between the ages of 11 and 13 from 8 different countries, and they're all young environmentalists in their own way, whether it's ocean plastics and recycling that they do, or fast fashion or climate, whatever it might be, and put them together. And I drove this yellow school bus across Europe, basically to get them to meet some of the most powerful leaders in the world. So we met the CEOs at Nestle and a really big bank in Europe, and the children got to air their concerns and have these discussions. And then we also swam in glacial lakes in Switzerland on the way there, played in the forests of Belgium, had this real rite of passage learning around nature. And then the kids, as we went along, formed this idea of this future council where they would go and address these large organisations and collaborate with them. So they didn't have to protest on the streets. They could actually get into the boardrooms. And they then invited another 1,000 children that had auditioned for the film and then held their own future council. So what we're doing now is raising money through various philanthropists and organisations to bring this future council alive so that, hopefully there's 1 million or so kids in there in the next few years who all feel like they're empowered and they're networking with each other, they're learning terrific skills about the future, and we're shaping the leaders of the future. And what are the skills they're going to need? How do they connect with each other? How do they make decisions collectively? All those things. So, it's been probably one of the more special projects I've ever done, just because the children, as you'll see in the film, are just extraordinary and beautiful and so insightful and emotionally brave in what they present. They do a lot of the grieving that I think adults are unable to do about the state of the world and where we're at, but they just share it in such a beautiful way that isn't, aggressive or in your face. It's just a very vulnerable thing to do, but they're also, very clever, very witty. And so it's sort of a fun adventure. It's a road trip across Europe where they're teaching me things, I'm teaching them things. And it's, certainly probably one of the most special projects I've ever done.
Wow. And what a great follow-on from the 2040 story to take it back to the future. Back to the future.
Back to the kids too,
Back to the kids. How wonderful. Another theme that we've explored on this podcast, and you will know her very well, Helena Norberg-Hodge, from Local Futures, and this whole story of local versus global, and I know you touch on that a lot in your film, 2040, and I'm assuming you will, it's part of the action areas, local and global. How do you think we're going? I mean, I would have hoped we'd learnt a big lesson in the pandemic of how important that was.
Yeah.
How do you see it?
I see it as an inevitability. I see that, there's so much inertia in the current system now, and it is so incredibly globalized. But as we found in COVID, the fragility of our system was just laid bare, that it's wound so tight for efficiency, to maximize every dollar, to get a cargo ship to land in a country right on time so those bananas are ripe at the right moment. When it does have a disruption, which we're going to get more and more of, we're already seeing it now in the Red Sea and what's happening there, but also, with more climate shocks, more geopolitical shocks that are definitely going to come, that fragility is going to be even more exposed. So how do we shore up our own sovereignty around our energy, around our food in our own countries? And this is a very delicate balance because, as we know, there's the temptation to tip into nationalism there. And the whole reason that this global interconnected setup was established was largely to avoid conflict, post World War II, so that, economic sanctions and trade was a way to keep us all at peace. So there's a real risk when we do start to localize of what might happen there. But I think people intrinsically feel that localization is the way to go because they understand their community. They know the people in their community. They understand the needs of that community, the particular weather types. And I think they're sick of decisions about their community being made by transnational corporations or by governments that are hundreds of kilometres away. They want more of a say about their region. And I think in Australia we've seen that with particularly the rise of the independent movement of people saying we're really sick of this two-party captured system. What about we offer up Jeanette, who used to work at the local CWA? Actually, she'd be good in Parliament. What do you know? She's got into Parliament. So to me, that is that's regenerative democracy. That's localisation. And I think we're going to be forced into that more and more in the future as we realise we can't just push a button and get some kind of food sent to us within 24 hours, which again is kind of madness, that we're going to have to start sourcing it locally. We're going to have to start getting to know our neighbours in a way that we haven't done for the last 30 or 40 years. We've been so hyper-individualised that we've lost that community feeling, and that's who we are. That's how we've evolved, is in groups of people that share, and anyone that's experienced that knows how much better it feels when you've got that community support, real human beings that are interacting with you and sharing meals or dancing or helping with your kids. It just feels good. And that's that wound again that we've come full circle to. That's healing that wound again. That's where we do feel better. And when we have that, we don't crave all these dopamine hits. We don't crave all this consumption or this feeling of being part of a community that's online, which again is an illusion because we're not really part of that, that we don't really know those people. We want it to feel it. We want the real version of that. So to me, that's where we're headed, whether we want to or not. I think the system itself is forcing us there. And that's, we talk about regenerative agriculture. That's how nature works. It is like the mycelium network, these little cells that all connect up to make something larger. They're not all homogenized. They're not all Starbucks and McDonald's everywhere around the world. That's not how nature works. It's very specific to a region that it's found in. And I think that's kind of who we are as human beings and what we want in our local communities. A real diversity, a mix of people and things that make us unique in our region. And then we connect up with a region that's near to us. They have their own set, but we have to find a way to get along with those people, interact and share resources. But that's where I think it might take us some time, because we've been so hyper-individualized that reconnecting those bonds, reweaving those connections is going to take a little bit of work because we're not used to it, and there's been such damage done that we've broken our trust. We've been told that we're deeply divisive. We watch shows like Survivor where it's all, survival of the fittest. My dream is that show Survivor was about a group of people that had to work together to all survive on an island, not to see who was going to be the last one standing, because that's the type of thinking or that's the type of storytelling we're going to need moving forward. That old thing of the sole person's going to make it is just nonsense. We're not going to change if we don't change that thinking. We have to find a way to surrender and work better with each other.
No, I could not agree more with you. And I think when I think about technology and I think about globalization, I feel like we're like kids in a sweet shop. We're very excited about all the possibilities, and that excitement's gone on for about 10, 15, maybe 20 years. Yeah. But if the evidence is anything to go by, and we're constantly told evidence-based is where we live. Well, if the evidence is anything to go by, mental health, environmental degradation, preventable chronic diseases, the evidence would suggest that isn't probably the best way to go.
No, and actually there was a quite a well-known American called Charles Munger who died recently. He was asked about, how do you predict the future? And he said, something around that if you show me the incentives and I'll be able to predict the future. And that's my big concern with AI, is that if it's embedded with the same incentives that our system has now, which it does, all it's going to do is accelerate what we already have. And what we're already doing is fragmenting society, unraveling democracy, destroying the living world. That AI is like pouring petrol onto the fire in terms of maximizing efficiency. So I don't know. No one really knows what that outcome is, but part of me feels like there's a subconscious summoning of this kind of digital deity that either is going to solve our problems that we hope for, or it's going to accelerate us to a demise so we can start again. I don't see a positive outcome for this. I do see eventually a positive outcome, but I see a problematic time just because I don't trust the incentives of the system. It's not designed to bring us together and to optimize for the best. It's designed to grab our attention, to keep us online, to divide us. And they're the incentives that have been baked into AI. So, I have real concerns for that. My hope is that I think we'll get to a point maybe in the next 5 years where, gosh, it will be harder to trust anything on the internet. They'll be so hard to delineate between deep fake videos, what's real, that it'll either force us to put down our phones for a while and not trust online and rebuild those communities, or again, force us to go, hang on, this is not working for us. What are new ways we can use this remarkable technology to do things differently, design new systems, new social platforms? I hope that's what it pushes up. But I do think, like you said, we've got the new toy. We need to play with it for a while, but we haven't realised it's going to burn our hands yet. But when it does, we'll drop it and then work out how to redesign it. But again, that's all speculative. I have no idea. No one has any idea. But it's just an incredible unknown territory we're venturing into.
But, your Regenerator site or movement is certainly a positive, as I've said, was the film. as a way of bringing people into and directing them in a way where they can actually do something about it. If someone was listening to this, and was wanting to, they're kind of, wow, this is really what, I mean, I would hope that many of my listeners would be well aware of many of these topics, but let's say, they weren't. And what would you say they could do to get started on this themselves? What would be some advice?
Well, I think that's why we built the platform, actually, was to sort of to say to people, if you really are at the starting point, you don't know where to go or what your interest is, there's actually, we've created an action plan. So you can hit this button there that says start regenerating. And then we ask you a series of questions about what you are interested in. You get to look at some topics and click on different things, ask how much time you have available, how you'd like to help. And then we offer up 10 or 12 things that you can do that align directly to your own personal interests. So again, we get away from this sort of Googling the top 5 things to do to help the system. No, let's be more prescriptive than that and actually really align to what people's passions are. So that's where I would encourage. And we've just linked to so many organisations there around the world, or different community groups that you can get involved with, of people that are sort of waking up to this stuff and starting to take it really seriously and doing extraordinary things. And as I said before, whether it's in regen ag or whether it's in different regenerative practices, there's a regenerative fashion movement, regenerative economics movement, regenerative democracy movement. There's so much going on around the world. It's just they don't get the cut through, they don't get the traction, again, because it's such a hopeful and positive message. But they are out there, and I think that's once you start seeing them, your world does open up, because it's like you've been looking with this really myopic lens just at how terrible the world is, and suddenly you go, oh, hang on a minute, there's all these other people that deeply care, that really want to do something and are getting on with it and doing it, finding money to grow their businesses or do different ways to amplify their work. But it is happening right around the world.
Well, Damon, thank you so much for not only all that you've done and are doing, but for joining us today and sharing that vision and that platform for collaboration moving forward. Thank you so much.
Good on you, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Well, as I said at the beginning of the episode, what I love about Damon's work is that it's not just about the doom and gloom. It's a vision of the future and a framework for us all to contribute and get involved in whatever area of interest you are interested in. And as I said, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the episode with Helena Norberg-Hodge, another hero of mine, who for over 40 years has been championing the power of local communities. Look, I feel so passionate about what Damon feels passionate about. I thought I'd share with you this trailer of Regenerating Australia 2030.
We leave you with a look back at the highlights of a remarkable decade that has changed Australia forever.
The 2020s began in extraordinary fashion.
Work more regionally.
More work, more opportunity.
Solar and batteries would be ideal.
I'll build a sustainable society.
Today marked the first time that Australia has run on 90% renewable energy for an entire month.
That makes me feel really, really happy.
The government today announced it will follow the lead of other countries and live stream key policy discussions.
I think it's good. We need transparency.
Australians are now seeking out Australian-made and owned products. The ripple effect is that we are now seeing healthy farmers.
There's nothing like endangered animals in a landscape that's coming back to life to give all Australians a real heartbeat.
We can deal better with the world when we're connected to nature.
It's been amazing to see the change that's happened from the closure of the power stations to the renewable energy zones. The young people are starting to stay and find work.
This family right now are earning cash because their electricity service provider are paying them to use the battery in this ute as storage for the grid.
In a decade full of transition and tragedy, many Australians are finding renewed purpose in the regeneration of our social and ecosystems. Australians are starting to feel more secure.
This is a landmark day for our country.
A day like this means that all of this work has actually meant something.
Respect is back, and our pride is back. Respecting the environment.
from that gives us the strength to look to a brighter future.
If not me, who? If not now, when do we do it? It's never too late to stand up and take action together.
Inspiring stuff. Remember the Regenerators.org. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences and conclusions.